What makes this moment so consequential is not the raid itself. It's the silence that surrounded it. Under the Constitution, Congress is not a bystander. It is meant to debate, to authorize, to constrain the use of force abroad, and yet, in this case, most lawmakers learned what had happened the same way you did through the news. Republican leaders offered explanations. Some argued that Congress can't be trusted with sensitive information. Others said this wasn't really a military action at all, but something closer to law enforcement. A few shrugged and suggested it was obvious something was coming anyway. Each argument sounds reasonable in isolation. Together, they reveal something more troubling: a growing comfort with executive power operating first and consulting later, if at all. The War Powers Resolution was designed to prevent exactly this kind of drift. It requires consultation, it demands accountability, but it also contains loopholes, and over time, presidents of both parties have learned how to slip through them. And that brings us to the deeper story here. To understand why this keeps happening, we have to look backward, not at this presidency alone, but at the history and habits that made it possible. To understand this moment, we have to rewind the clock. The modern presidency did not seize power overnight. It accumulated it slowly, legally, and often with congressional consent. After Vietnam, lawmakers tried to reassert themselves. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 was Congress pushing back, insisting that presidents could no longer drag the country into conflict without consultation. It was meant to restore balance after years of undeclared war. But history had other plans. From the Cold War onward, speed became the ultimate currency of power. Threats were described as imminent, intelligence as fragile, action as urgent. Presidents learned that if they moved fast enough, Congress would argue later and usually accept the new reality. Over time, consultation turned into notification. Notification turned into briefings after the fact. And precedent hardened into habit. From hostage rescues to targeted raids, from counterterrorism to drug enforcement, the line between war and policing blurred. Each exception made the next one easier. Each silence from Congress made executive action feel normal. So when Venezuela happened, it didn't feel radical. It felt familiar. And that's precisely the danger, because once power shifts quietly, it rarely shifts back without a crisis. And the first real test of that shift came sooner than most people realized. The first real shock came when the details began to surface. This was not a speech, not a warning shot. It was a live operation executed before Congress could weigh in, and revealed only after it was complete. By the time lawmakers gathered for briefings on Capitol Hill, the central fact was already irreversible. Nicolas Maduro had been captured to face an American courtroom. For some Republicans, that outcome justified the method. For others, the questions came too late. Why were key committee chairs excluded? Why was military force blended so seamlessly with the justice system? And why did notification come only after the most consequential decision had already been made? The administration offered an answer without quite saying it out loud. This wasn't really a war. Framed as an arrest, not an invasion, the operation slid neatly between legal categories. It used the military but spoke the language of law enforcement. It killed people but avoided the label of armed conflict. And that framing mattered, because once Congress accepts that logic, it sets a powerful precedent, one that future presidents won't hesitate to use. If you're trying to understand how democratic oversight erodes, moments like this are the inflection points, and they lead directly to a more uncomfortable question. What was really going on beneath the surface? That's where we go next. What sat beneath the surface was not chaos, but design. The administration didn't ignore the law. It navigated around it by framing the operation as an arrest, not an act of war. It activated a different legal logic. Law enforcement doesn't require advance congressional approval. Arrests happen fast, quietly, And under executive authority, that distinction did the real work. The military became a tool, not the headline. Deadly force was described as defensive, collateral damage as incidental, and the broader mission as narrow and contained. This is where inherent power enters the conversation. The Constitution doesn't spell it out, but over time, presidents have argued that certain powers are implied, especially when protecting American personnel or responding to imminent threats. In this case, the threat was defined expansively. Maduro wasn't just a foreign leader. He was labeled a narco-terrorist. The drug trade wasn't just criminal. It was framed as an attack. That logic collapses distance. It turns foreign territory into an extension of domestic enforcement, and it allows the president to act first, while Congress debates definitions later. This isn't a loophole by accident. It's a system that rewards speed, ambiguity, and unilateral action. And once it's used successfully, it becomes harder to challenge the next time, because the next crisis was already waiting. The second crisis wasn't louder. It was quieter and more revealing. As the dust settled, a Navy armada remained in the Caribbean, no declaration of war, no clear timeline, no public plan for what came next. And that ambiguity mattered. Under the War Powers Resolution, military action without congressional approval is supposed to end after 60 days. But that clock only starts ticking if the action is clearly defined as a military engagement. Here it wasn't. No long-term troops on the ground, no formal invasion, just presence, pressure, and the implicit threat of force. That gray zone is where modern power thrives. The administration could argue it had complied with the law, briefings were held, notifications made. Critics could argue Congress had been sidelined, and in the middle, the public was left with unanswered questions. How much will this cost? What is the end game for Venezuela? And who decides when this operation is truly over? A resolution demanding congressional approval was introduced. It faced long odds because passing it would require lawmakers to reclaim authority they've spent decades giving away. And that's the real crisis, not just of law, but of political will. And it lands, inevitably, on the people least able to influence it directly. That's where we turn next. If you're watching this from your home, your phone in your hand, this might all feel distant, abstract, procedural. But it isn't, because every time Congress steps back, someone else steps forward in your name. When military force is used without debate, it's not just a constitutional issue. It's a human one. It affects where your tax dollars go, how your country is seen, and how easily power can be used again. You don't vote on raids. You don't vote on emergency authorities. You don't get a say when law enforcement and war blur into one. And yet, the consequences land with you. Higher costs, longer commitments, more precedents that make the next decision easier and faster. This isn't about whether you support or oppose this president. It's about whether any president should be able to act first and explain later. If you care about accountability not as a slogan, but as a safeguard, this is the moment to pay attention, to question, to stay engaged. Because when citizens disengage, institutions don't just weaken, they hollow out. And what's happening here doesn't stop at America's borders. It ripples outward, reshaping alliances, expectations, and global power itself. That's where we go next. What happens in Washington never stays in Washington. When the United States acts unilaterally, the world takes notes. Allies watch the process, not just the outcome. Adversaries study the precedent. By treating a foreign leader's capture as a law enforcement action, the U.S. sends a complicated signal. It suggests that borders are flexible when threats are defined broadly enough. That sovereignty can be bypassed without a declaration of war. That power can be exercised first and justified later. For some countries, this feels like protection. For others, it feels like warning. If the world's most powerful democracy can blur the line between arrest and invasion, others will feel entitled to do the same. Russia, China, regional powers with fewer checks and far less transparency. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about norms. Global order depends less on written rules than on repeated behavior. And when Congress recedes, the presidency becomes the face of American power, fast, flexible, and increasingly personal. That may feel effective in the short term, but over time, it erodes trust. It weakens alliances built on predictability, and it accelerates a world where power matters more than process. Which brings us to the final unavoidable question. If this is the trajectory, what comes next? There are only a few plausible paths forward. There are three ways this story can unfold. The first is the optimistic one. Congress reasserts itself. The War Powers Resolution passes. Lawmakers of both parties decide that efficiency is not a substitute for legitimacy. In this future, presidents still act quickly, but within clearer boundaries. Consultation becomes real again, not performative, not after the fact. The second path is the most likely. Nothing dramatic happens. The resolution fails by a handful of votes. Debate fades. The precedent holds. Future presidents, Republican and Democrats, cite this moment as justification. Each action slightly broader than the last. Each explanation a little thinner. Power doesn't concentrate overnight. It drifts, quietly, legally. The third path is the darkest. A future crisis turns deadly for Americans. Lives are lost, costs explode, and only then does Congress ask why it wasn't consulted. History shows this pattern clearly. Institutions rarely correct themselves in calm moments. They react after catastrophe. The uncomfortable truth is this: the future of congressional power doesn't hinge on law alone. It hinges on will. And that leaves us with one final insight about democracy itself. Because systems don't fail when rules disappear. They fail when no one insists on enforcing them. That's where we end. Democracy doesn't usually collapse with a bang. It erodes with a shrug. What we've been watching isn't just a debate over Venezuela or Trump or one operation carried out before dawn. It's a lesson in how power actually shifts in modern systems. Not by breaking the law, but by stretching it, interpreting it, and relying on the fact that resistance is often quieter than action. Congress still has powers on paper. The Constitution hasn't changed. The War Powers Resolution still exists. What's changed is the habit of using them. When lawmakers accept being informed after the fact, they normalize it. When citizens stop asking who decides, they legitimize it. And when urgency becomes the excuse for everything, accountability becomes optional. This is not about one president. It's about the precedent every president inherits. If you want to understand where democracy is headed, don't just watch elections. Watch procedures. Watch who decides and who stays silent. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, stay with me, share it, question it, and keep watching closely. Because the next test of power won't announce itself in advance. It never does.